Good afternoon, folks. This is Danielle Sass-Burnett with NARUC on behalf of the NARUC-NASIO Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning. You're here for today's webinar on Distribution System Planning Fundamentals and Promising Practices. We'll give folks one more minute to join and then we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the latest in the monthly series of webinars associated with the NARUC-NASIO Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning. This is Danielle Sass-Burnett with NARUC, and as most of you probably know who are on the line, we have designed a monthly webinar series following our first workshop together in April of this past year and leading up to the next workshop in October. And each of these webinars has been in response to requests we received from task force members for additional education and information to support their efforts associated with the Comprehensive Electricity Planning Task Force. Today's webinar is on Distribution System Planning Fundamentals and Promising Practices. We are very excited to be able to share with you additional information about distribution system planning and how it's actually conducted in the states. That is something that we've heard a lot of interest in among task force members. And we have a stellar panel for you today. We are joined by Kurt Volkman from Grid Lab, an independent consultant, John Cheneau from the Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP, and for our case study, the Minnesota Commission, Commissioner Dan Lipschultz, and Senior Advisor Tricia DeBleeker. I'm going to give you a brief bio for each of them in just a moment. But the way we'll run the webinar today is each of them will be giving presentations for about 20-25 minutes. We will allow for questions after each presentation, clarifying or brief questions as we transition to the next presenter. And then we will open it up for question and answer additionally at the end of the webinar for further information. So as I said, for bios, Kurt Volkman is an independent consultant and member of the Grid Lab Network, part of a team of technical experts supporting policymakers with the transition to a low carbon energy future. He has 35 years of utility industry experience, and since 2015 has supported clients as an expert witness or technical advisor in distribution planning and grid modernization proceedings in 13 states, and will offer us a wealth of expertise. Next will be John Cheneau, who many of you met at the last task force meeting, or probably in your other travels. John is a senior advisor to RAP, an active member of the core team for the task force, and we're grateful for that, and lead editor of a forthcoming report offering guidance to public utility commissions on distribution planning. John has worked in environmental and utility regulation for more than 25 years. Thank you, John. And then from the Minnesota Commission, Dan Lipschultz is the Vice Chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. He was appointed in 2014 and became Vice Chair in 2017. Commissioner Lipschultz has practiced law in the areas regulated by the Commission for over 25 years as both a public and private sector attorney. And he is accompanied by the very able Tricia DeBleeker, who is Senior Planning Director with the Minnesota Commission. She has facilitated the state's efforts on grid modernization and distribution planning, as well as serving as co-chair for the organization of MISO State's DER work group. She spent 20 years in the industry, and prior to joining the commission was a project manager and consultant to energy and manufacturing clients. So we have a stellar panel, as I said, and I am very excited to turn it over to Kurt Volkman for our first presentation. Kurt?
Thank you, Danielle. Good afternoon, everybody. How's that look, Danielle?
It looks great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. The information that I'm going to go through in my portion of the webinar this afternoon is based on some work that we at Grid Lab did for the PUC of Ohio last year as part of their Power Forward proceeding. In that work, we reviewed over 35 papers and reports and other documents related to this topic of integrated distribution planning. We interviewed the Ohio utilities. We talked to some developers that were active in the Ohio market, and ultimately synthesized all that information into a white paper, which we published late last year. And at the end of my slides, I will provide a link to that paper for your reference. But why is this topic even important? And I'm just going to offer a couple thoughts, and I know John and others are going to talk about this as well. But first and foremost, although it does vary by state, the combination of declining costs and growing customer interest has led to, in some cases, very significant growth in all types of distributed energy resources. And when I use that term, I'm including both solar and wind distributed generation, energy efficiency, EE, DR, demand response, combined heat and power, electric vehicles, storage, and then combinations of these resources operating together in the form of a microgrid. So all of those things we're seeing more and more of them on the distribution system. So what does that mean? Well, for one thing, it means distribution planning is getting a lot harder. It's not as straightforward as it once was, and there are new requirements for additional capabilities and additional tools, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. It also means that we now have new types of flexibility that we didn't have in the past. And I often use this diagram and stole it from SolarCity/Tesla in a report that they published back in 2016 to illustrate this concept. If you see the diagram on the left, it shows the conventional approach for addressing load growth or addressing a capacity need. And you can see it's very lumpy and very bulky, and ultimately results in periods of time where there's significant unutilized capacity. And even worse, if the load growth doesn't really materialize, you end up with significant stranded costs. If you contrast that with the diagram on the right, where it illustrates a more modular and smaller deployment of distributed solutions, it not only lowers costs, but you end up with higher asset utilization. So that's the concept that I'm referring to when I talk about flexibility. But perhaps most importantly, the significant number of new resources that are connected to the distribution system, and in many cases, they're financed, owned, and operated by customers and third parties. This gives a tremendous opportunity for these resources to provide grid services and reduce the need for ratepayer-funded capital investments. And when I talk about grid services, I'm referring to capacity increases or peak load reduction, voltage support, reliability, resilience, and support for increased hosting capacity. And again, I'll talk more about that in a bit. So there are many examples of this being applied across the country, but one that we highlighted in the paper last year was Central Hudson Gas and Electric's Peak Perks program, where they're deploying smart thermostats and pool pumps in kind of a unique way. So it's not unusual for utilities to deploy these types of demand response resources to support overall system-wide load reduction. But in the case of Central Hudson, they've identified a need for a 16 megawatt peak load reduction across 3 specific zones of the distribution system. And they've identified, or they did identify, over 60,000 customers in these zones that were eligible for these resources, applied some very aggressive targeted marketing, and are providing some pretty attractive incentives for customers to participate in this program. As you recall, the sign-up award for the thermostat program is on the order of $85 or $100, and then there are additional annual rewards that customers earn depending on how big of an adjustment they allow the utility to make on the thermostat. So again, it's a conventional demand response resource, but it's being applied in a way to address a specific distribution circuit substation, and I believe there's a transmission deferral related to this as well. So that's an example of what we're talking about here. So there is a significant opportunity, and I'm aware of at least a half a dozen states that are actively implementing changes to the way they do distribution planning. There's a handful of other states I'm aware of that are at least investigating the potential. But to fully understand what changes are really required, I think it's important to have a kind of a basic understanding of how distribution planning is done today. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of walking through the typical distribution planning process. It typically begins in the fall. Most utilities in North America are summer peaking, meaning their peak loads occur in the hot July, August months. And so the distribution planning process begins typically in the fall with the load forecasting activities. And this is largely looking at the previous summer's peak and weaving into the forecast information about known bulk load increases or decreases, so industrial customers moving into the area or moving out of the area, et cetera. I purposely illustrate in this diagram a disconnect between the distribution planning functions and the energy efficiency and demand response functions. That's because oftentimes there is really an organizational disconnect in the utility. There are often different leaders, different leadership, different performance incentives, and it's not unusual for distribution planners to not really be aware of where these energy efficiency demand response resources are located on the system. And conversely, it's not unusual for the program administrators to not really even know what circuits these resources are being deployed to. So it's an issue that needs to be addressed, is this disconnect between the functions and the utility. In its most simplistic form, then, this load forecasts are translated into a forward-looking projection of what peak loads would be, and sometimes it's just simply a fixed growth rate. And I illustrate that in this example from an actual utility in their, I believe it was in their 2016 distribution plan. A couple observations about this. You note that in the prior 10 years leading up to 2015 or 2016, there was a significant amount of volatility in the peak load. But beginning in 2016, the utility assumes a straight line extrapolation into the future. There's no acknowledgement of any uncertainty or variability going forward. And this is what we refer to as a deterministic approach, meaning that there is no acknowledgement that there is uncertainty when we all know that there is, in fact, a lot of uncertainty. Another observation about this diagram is the loading criteria. You see they say they want 75% utilization maximum and a 70% preferred for this concept of operational flexibility. What that means is there, again, will be significant underutilized assets. And we're seeing this more and more as part of often grid modernization proceedings where utilities are kind of arbitrarily lowering their loading guidelines in the interest of operational flexibility. And again, this is resulting in gold plating, underutilized assets, and basically overbuilt systems. So once load forecasts are determined, there is a system assessment that's done, and this is typically a combination of power flow modeling and short circuit calculations to answer questions like, is there sufficient capacity to meet the expected load growth? Are there any expected voltage violations anywhere on the circuits? Is our system protection adequate? Is our reliability performance meeting our objectives? So that's all part of the overall system assessment. It's typically done in what are referred to often as planning areas. So a typical utility will have multiple areas or zones or planning areas, and they'll have an engineer assigned to each of them. Each of those engineers does their system assessment to come up with what they identify as grid needs. I also illustrate in this diagram a somewhat loose connection between the system assessment activities and the DG interconnection process. It's not uncommon for the locations and the sizes of distributed resources to not be reflected in the circuit models that the engineers are using. In some cases, most often with smaller utilities, the interconnection work is done by outside consultants, and it's not unusual for those consultants to be using completely different tool sets and data models. So again, there's unfortunately often a disconnect between the interconnection activities and the distribution system planning activities. So once the system assessment is complete, there's the activities of identifying what we refer to as grid needs. So a grid need could be additional capacity. It could be the need for reactive power for voltage support. It could be a reliability improvement need. But the grid needs then lead to the solution identification. Solutions become projects. Projects get assigned budgets, and ultimately there becomes an overall spending plan for the subsequent year or two. In today's world, however, the solution set is largely limited to conventional utility capital investments. So things like new substations, new circuits, rebuilding existing circuits, converting overhead to underground, installing voltage regulators, things like that. Those are typically the solutions that utilities consider to address the grid needs. Once the budget and spending plan is established, they move into the design and construction phases of these projects. And then there's the ongoing day-to-day distribution operations or system monitoring and control. So that's kind of today's distribution planning process. And I will make a couple more observations about this process. First, it's a very closed process, meaning that outside of what are often very contentious rate case proceedings, there's very little opportunity for regulators and staff and stakeholders to really understand the data, the analysis, the assumptions that go into the overall spending plan. Second observation, as I've mentioned a couple times, is very siloed. It's siloed by the nature of how the local distribution planning area grid needs assessments roll up to an overall plan. Oftentimes the distribution planning areas don't really communicate between each other that well. The disconnect between energy efficiency demand response that I mentioned. There's also often disconnects between the transmission and the distribution organizations. So overall, it's a pretty siloed set of activities. So now I want to turn to contrast this with what we refer to as integrated distribution planning, or IDP. And there are several changes going from the old way to the new way. The first, as reflected here, is an explicit consideration of all types of distributed resources in the forecasting process. So this requires a much tighter integration with the energy efficiency demand response functions. It requires a much tighter integration with the interconnection set of activities. So the planners not only know the locations of where these resources are, but they can forecast their impact on loads and their potential to provide additional grid services. As part of the system assessment, it's also important to know how much additional distributed energy resources, not just solar, but all DER types, a distribution circuit can accommodate without requiring upgrades. And that analysis is often referred to as hosting capacity. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. As part of the grid needs assessment, it's also important to come up with some determination of the value associated with addressing the need at each location. Ideally, that locational value and the grid needs become publicly available. They're published, not all of them necessarily, but by giving customers and third parties an opportunity to understand where these grid needs are and what the associated locational value is, leads to the consideration of customer and third-party solutions to address those grid needs in the form of non-wire solutions, sometimes called non-wires alternatives, or NWA. The project design and construction activity needs to be much more collaborative if it involves a third-party or customer non-wire solution. And the utility, not just the planning function, but the utility in general, needs to develop new capabilities for acquiring these non-wire solutions. And again, I'll talk more about that in a bit. The ongoing system monitoring and control needs to be complemented by some level of DER monitoring and control. And I'd like to emphasize that we are not at all advocating that the utility must control all DER. In fact, new DER with advanced inverters have the ability to autonomously provide grid services, and they do not need direct communications and control. But larger DER, where there's some aggregation, the smaller DER, where the utility is counting on that for grid services, those may require some level of direct control, direct monitoring and control. So overall, this is what we mean by integrated distribution planning. And I'd like to just make a few quick comments on the topic of grid modernization. I know that that's not the direct topic that we're addressing today, but it comes up often. And we believe a good grid modernization plan is the output of an effective integrated distribution planning process. And we think a good grid mod plan should have very thoughtful consideration of the real system impacts of DER and the forecasted impacts of the DER growth. We think a good grid mod plan should reflect a true understanding of each circuit's ability to accommodate more DER and where circuit upgrades are legitimately needed. We think a good grid mod plan should reflect some sort of an understanding of the locational value of addressing the various grid needs. And a good grid mod plan should reflect an understanding of the potential for deploying non-wire solutions or non-wires alternatives. And lastly, a good grid mod plan should reflect a realistic assessment of the foundational tools and technologies that are genuinely needed to move to this new world of integrated distribution planning. And I emphasize the word real often there when I just described that, and that's because we've seen too many grid mod filings where there are exaggerated claims of all the badness that DER is causing, and really no evidence to support it. That in some cases, very significant capital expenditures that utilities are claiming are required. So again, we believe a grid mod plan should follow some form of an integrated distribution plan. So this world of IDP requires at least 5 new capabilities. We describe them in depth in the paper, and I will go through them briefly here. The first is related to improved capabilities for forecasting and system modeling. This includes moving to more probabilistic forecasting. This is getting away from the deterministic approach and acknowledging that there is in fact uncertainty and that there's a range of potential outcomes for load and DER growth. It should include some form of DER adoption scenario analysis that reflects not only the expected quantities of DER, but the expected locations of where on the distribution system you expect to see them. There's a need for more granular load and power flow modeling. So moving away from this single peak load value from the previous year, become more sophisticated about modeling load flows across the distribution circuits. It's important to be able to factor in and model the capabilities of new smart inverters, as well as I mentioned before, the ability to monitor and optimize the DER that are connected to the system. The second new capability I mentioned before is this hosting capacity analysis. There are a lot of good resources out there describing the various methodologies. There are at least 4 different ways of doing hosting capacity analysis, each of them having different levels of accuracy and different levels of computational intensity. Here's an example, output from 2 different utilities. The one on the left is Southern Cal Edison. The one on the right is Pepco. Each of them use 2 different methodologies, but as you can see in the maps, they've chosen to display the results in a way that's pretty useful for customers and developers, because you're actually able to locate specific circuit locations to determine what the additional capacity is. You'll note also in the California case in Edison, they're not only providing it for PV, but they're providing it for load. So think of electric vehicles as well as uniform generation. So different DER types are displayed. So again, a lot of resources out there, and I think I just want to make one comment that I think is really important, and that is the work up front to identify what you intend to do with the results of the hosting capacity. And this is often referred to as the use cases of the hosting capacity results. And it's very important, we think, for commissions to establish common use cases in cases where there are multiple utilities across the state, because then that leads to really a simplification of the implementation and the oversight process, and makes it much easier for customers and developers in the state to use the tools. So defining the use cases up front then determines what the appropriate methodology is. And again, we think it's important to have consistency across the state. The third capability is related to the disclosure of grid needs and locational value. And think of this as kind of a complementary analysis to hosting capacity. Hosting capacity maps show where DER can avoid creating problems. The locational value assessments can show where DER can actually help address problems like peak loads or voltage support or whatever, and it sets the stage for identifying opportunities for non-wire solutions. The utilities in New York and Rhode Island, as a matter of fact, publish heat maps showing locational value in addition to the hosting capacity results. I also should mention that not all utility investments, utility project types are candidates for non-wire solutions. But thinking through what types of projects are good candidates is also an important exercise. And that activity is often referred to as defining the non-wire solution suitability criteria, or non-wires alternative suitability criteria. So that's an important activity as well. The next is related to the acquisition of the non-wire solution. I mentioned this is a new capability, and we often think of this in terms of three ways to do it: pricing, programs, and procurement. Pricing, think of a time of use rate that a utility might offer to influence electric vehicle charging behavior to avoid the need for grid upgrades. That would be an example of a pricing solution acquisition. A program solution acquisition, the Central Hudson Peak Perks program that I just described is a good example of that. And there are many others. I was in Michigan last week for a distribution planning stakeholder meeting and learned that both consumers and DTE are planning to pilot non-wires alternative programs using some of their existing energy efficiency and demand response resources, specifically smart thermostats. So that's a pretty common approach that many utilities are considering. And procurement is probably the most common example. And this is where a utility conducts a competitive solicitation to procure a distributed resource. And there are many examples of that in the paper. And then lastly, it's a common theme throughout the paper, and something that we heard over and over again is the need to have much more of a meaningful stakeholder engagement. And this involves increased transparency, a lot more collaboration between utilities, stakeholders, regulators, increased internal utility collaboration. So I've mentioned silos before, so breaking down some of those silos and working together more collaboratively on these new solutions is really important. In the paper, we provide a lot of best practices for how to conduct this meaningful stakeholder engagement, but it's probably one of the hardest new capabilities, but it's probably one of the most important as well. So in wrapping this up, the PUC of Ohio asked for some specific recommendations on how they could get started with this, and we provided, I'll go through three that we recommended. The first being the important step of establishing very clear objectives and guiding principles and expectations for what you intend to get out of this process. I participated in the California Distribution Resources Plan proceeding, and it was far from perfect, but there was clear direction from the Commission as to what their expectations were. There was a regular set of rulings and orders that kept the process moving forward while eliminating a lot of the ambiguity, which led to a lot of good progress and a lot of good work out there. In contrast, I've participated in other proceedings where there was not clear guidance from the Commission, and the participants often were continuously questioning why we were doing it, what it's going to lead to, and it became a much less productive process. So this is a very important first step. Because there's often very little knowledge and understanding of how the utilities do this today, again, particularly in a state where there are multiple utilities, we thought it was very important to require a filing of some reports to understand their current planning capabilities today. This includes the tools that they use, their methodologies, their assumptions, We also recommended that the utilities propose what they consider to be appropriate hosting capacity use cases, as well as what they consider to be appropriate non-wires alternative suitability criteria, as well as a process for beginning to pilot non-wire solutions. These reports, where they've done it, often reveal some very interesting similarities and differences across the utilities and the different approaches that they take, but it provides a common understanding for the commission staff and stakeholders of where each utility is starting from. And you conclude that it might not be the same path for every utility depending on where they're starting from. And I believe you'll hear a bit about how Minnesota approached this later in this webinar. And lastly, because much of this is very technical, we recommended in Ohio that they establish some specific technical working groups to begin to work through some of these thornier issues, like what do we expect the DER adoption and growth to be across the state? What are the appropriate smart inverter functions and settings that we're going to require as DER is deployed? What are, in fact, the appropriate suitability criteria, and how are we going to begin to pilot these non-wire solutions? And what are the appropriate hosting capacity use cases, and what's our timeline and methodology? What's the right methodology, and how are we going to roll this out? And then lastly, because much of this begins to require the publication and disclosure of information in new ways, a good discussion about what's the appropriate form of data sharing, what types of portals will we create to begin to sharing this information is an important topic for this working group to discuss. So here are a couple resources to learn more. The one on the left is the paper that I keep referencing. It's available on the Grid Lab website under the Publications tab. And I'll also point you to a late last year publication from the Rocky Mountain Institute on what they call the Non-Wire Solutions Playbook. It's a very rich resource that has lots of good case studies and examples and best practices of how to do this thing called non-wire solutions. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to John to talk, to hear from him about some thoughts on the oversight of this process.
Thank you so much, Kurt. This is Danielle. I'm going to bring us back up here. We said to everyone that we would be happy to take some clarifying questions after each presentation. You're welcome to type those into the chat box or raise your hand virtually on your control panel. And in fact, we do have a couple of questions, Kurt, if you don't mind. And we also have one hand raised. So we'll spend a few minutes here before we move to John. The first question was from Carrie Gill from Rhode Island. Do utilities make any adjustments for impacts of climate change in their forecasting models, as far as you have seen?
Not explicitly, no. I have not seen that yet.
Okay, thank you. The next question was from Eric Hanser, who is in Michigan. This is a big one and a big part of the task force, but interested in your initial reaction. What can state regulators do to align distribution and transmission planning assumptions and plans, particularly when they are not vertically integrated and are owned by different companies? And that's the focus of the task force, but if you have any initial recommendations or comments, we would love to hear them.
Yeah, I don't have any well thought out recommendations. I do realize that's a big part of the scope of this task force. My observation is that the transmission entity, whether that be part of the utility or a separate organization like it is in Michigan, often just thinks of the distribution load as a lump load at the point of interconnection to the transmission system, and really hasn't come to appreciate the variable nature and the additional resources, I'm thinking of voltage support, that can now increasingly come from the different distribution nodes where they interconnect. So there's a lot of richness to what can come from distribution that the transmission owners need to become to appreciate, and that starts with a lot more communication and collaboration than I think has been done to date. So when I talk about the silos and the need for meaningful stakeholder engagement, that's a huge intersection point that maybe I didn't emphasize enough, and that's between the transmission entity and distribution. So I I'm beginning to think about this a lot, particularly as it relates to how distribution fits into the IRP process. But at this point, I can't really articulate some well thought out perspectives on that. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. And in fact, I'll take half a minute to plug the National Council on Electricity Policy, electricitypolicy.org online, because they are hosting a workshop the first full week in September around transmission and distribution coordination, specifically with this challenge in mind. And that is open to anyone who's interested in attending. And registration is not yet closed. So if anyone's interested in further exploring the T&D intersection in particular, that is an event that might be worth attending. We'll be spending quite a bit of time on it there. I see that Chairman Bob Burns from Arizona has raised his hand. Chairman Burns, I've just opened your line if you'd like to speak your question. Chairman Burns, your line is open. Okay. We will see if anything else comes up there. We have one other question, two other questions. Could you please discuss, I guess briefly, cybersecurity and physical security risks regarding hosting capacity analysis and disclosing grid needs? This is frequently cited as, I think, a challenge for utilities, and along the same lines, potentially from sharing heat maps. Do you have a perspective on that, Kurt?
Yeah, it is an issue that every state has to wrestle with. In some cases, they've concluded that those risks that you refer to, security risks, cyber risk, et cetera, outweigh the importance of providing granular information at the circuit level. And so the maps that are published are not as crisp and clear as the ones that I showed in my slides. California utilities have worked through a lot of that, and they are more comfortable than perhaps other states in disclosing not only hosting capacity by location, but load information in the various locations in the circuits. I know other states are in these various stages of working through that, so I can't generalize and say there's one way to do it. I just acknowledge that that is a very important issue that you need to work through as you begin to identify the best way to disclose not just hosting capacity, but grid needs and location value and all that kind of stuff. It's a very important issue.
Thank you so much, Kurt. We will let you sit back until the next Q&A session towards the end. And right now we're going to turn to John Cheneau from RAP to discuss guidance for public utility commissions. John, I've got your slides up, so please say next slide when you're ready.
I will do that. Thank you, Danielle. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, crystal clear.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. This is John Cheneau from RAP. And I want to start by thanking NARUC and DOE for inviting me to participate. And thank all of you for making time on your busy schedules to talk about this topic. When we met in Denver and the cohorts were working on their process maps, one of the things I noticed was that there was a tendency in most of the groups, maybe all of the groups, to put two kind of different things onto the same map. There was a lot of stuff on the maps that was about the planning process, the steps in the planning process, like Kurt just outlined. But there were also a lot of things going on to those maps that had to do with regulatory process. So now that Kurt's given us an overview of IDP, Integrated Distribution Planning, I'm going to focus more on the role of regulators in overseeing that planning process. There will be a little bit of overlap with what Kurt has presented, but hopefully not too much. And so let's get started on that. Next slide, please. I think Kurt did a good job of explaining how a modern integrated approach to distribution system planning differs from what I'll call a more traditional planning approach. But implicit in his presentation is the fact that there is a traditional approach. I think we know that utilities have always done some form of distribution planning. And Kurt hinted at this. The thing is that for regulators, for consumer advocates, and other stakeholders, that planning process has traditionally been a black box. So I would argue that the new trend isn't utilities doing distribution planning or doing it in an integrated fashion. It's that regulators are starting to consider whether they should order utilities to do that planning process in a much more transparent way. And that might mean laying down the ground rules as well as exercising some oversight of the process. So let's start by asking why regulators might want to take a more active role in this really complex activity. Next slide. And the first thing I'd point to is that distribution system costs are rising pretty steadily, as shown in this chart from the Energy Information Administration, or EIA. Capital investments, you can see, are the biggest contributor to distribution costs, but total costs have been rising for 2 decades. Next slide. And not only are distribution costs going up, but they're going up much faster than the rate of inflation. So this chart, which I borrowed from a new article in Public Utilities Fortnightly, which I commend you, it shows how costs have changed since 2010. So there's a percentage change from 2010 on the vertical axis. The two downward sloping lines show that peak demand per customer, which is the orange line, and total energy use per customer, which is the blue line, have actually gone down since 2010. The dotted line is inflation. The dotted line shows that the consumer price index has risen somewhat since 2010. But look at that solid black line. Distribution spending per customer has risen at more than twice the rate of inflation since 2010. Next slide. The final data point I'll share with you puts these distribution system costs into context. It's just knowing that they're growing only tells you part of the story. This chart shows that the portion of total retail electricity bills that is going towards paying for distribution system costs is projected by EIA to grow. Again, to grow fairly steadily. In 2017, just a couple years ago, that represented about 1/4 of the average customer's bill. Distribution costs were about 1/4 of the total bill. By 2040, those costs will comprise more than 1/3 of the bill. So hopefully by now it should be obvious why regulators are starting to pay more attention to distribution planning. It's a big and growing cost center. The costs ultimately fall on consumers. The options for meeting distribution system needs are expanding, and thus effective oversight of utility planning and investment is not peripheral, but rather essential for protecting the public interest. Next slide. So now I'm going to shift gears and tell you about a project I've been working on for the past year. I've been one of the authors and the lead editor of a guide to IDP that is being developed through an informal voluntary collaborative called MADRI. Next slide. MADRI is the Mid-Atlantic Distributed Resources Initiative. For the past 15 years, RAP has helped convene stakeholders through MADRI. And these are stakeholders from the fully restructured states within the PJM footprint. And they get together to talk about distributed resource challenges and opportunities. The PJM footprint, which is shown in blue on that map, includes some states that are not fully restructured. So the ones that are participating in MADRI are the restructured ones with the red stars on them. MADRI meets roughly 4 times a year, and we have occasionally produced guidance documents on topics like interconnection, procedures, advanced metering, and revenue decoupling. The latest project we've been working on over the past year is that a team of volunteers has been working on a guidance document on IDP. The status of that is that a final draft is currently under review by a MADRI steering committee, and the guidance will hopefully be published sometime in the next month. Next slide. So the MADRI IDP guidance will explain some of the material Kurt went over, the nuts and bolts of a modern integrated approach to planning and the challenges to expect and those sorts of things. And in fact, we borrowed really heavily from the reference documents that Kurt showed you at the end of his presentation. But our document also offers guidance specifically on the role of utility commissions in overseeing that planning process. And it suggests some of the key decisions that regulators might have to make. Right here, you see a flow chart that summarizes a generic oversight process that could be tailored to the needs of each state and each regulatory commission. As we all know, every state's unique, and every state that mandates IDP will take a somewhat different approach to oversight. So again, this is just an indicative or generic process. But for the rest of my presentation, what I'd like to do is kind of walk you through it step by step. Next slide, please. So we'll begin with the blue shaded boxes in the upper left corner of the chart. And this is really starting with the basics, but a recommended first step in oversight to review your commission's statutory authority and determine if you already have the legal authority to impose some kind of mandatory, transparent planning requirements on the utilities you regulate. Next slide. If the answer to that question is no, that might be game over, but some commissions may choose to investigate IDP and the value of IDP through an informal proceeding. And it might be that through that kind of informal workshop or investigation, you decide that you'd like to do IDP, but you need authority, and you might request that authority from your legislature. We all know you can't control what the legislature does, but if they grant you that authority, then we'll be back to where we were if you had it to begin with. So next slide. What I'm trying to say is if or when the commission confirms that it has the authority to impose some kind of planning requirement on utilities, the next step, as is often the case, might be to decide whether you want to create administrative rules to govern that process, or whether you just want to initiate the planning process without rules through maybe a more specific order. Next slide. But this is where you end up with either way, with or without administrative rules. You'll probably eventually end up issuing an order that directs utilities to develop integrated distribution plans. I think virtually always that order will establish the process requirements for planning, as well as the filing requirements. But it may also address a bunch of other issues. Next slide, please. For example, the MADRI guidance suggests a handful of key decisions that commissions might want to make in an order that initiates an IDP process. One such decision might involve the scope of plans. So do you want each utility to develop its own plan using its own process? Or do you want a single statewide plan, which is hard to imagine, but I wouldn't want to rule it out. Or maybe you want utility-specific plans, but you want all of the utilities under your jurisdiction to rely on common elements or common assumptions that are used statewide. that's the first scope question. The second scope question is about the DERs that you want the utilities to consider in the planning process. And I think Kurt gave you kind of like the full list of DERs. The truth is that some commissions might want to be really specific in telling the utilities which DERs to consider, because if they aren't specific, it's possible that they will overlook some of them. Demand response, for example, has sometimes been overlooked in utility planning processes. The commission will probably want to specify the planning horizon. For example, whether the plan should cover 5 or 10 or 20 years into the future, and also how frequently they should be updated, which might be every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, something like that. They want to specify at the outset the expected or the required opportunities for stakeholders to participate. And Kurt alluded to the fact that stakeholder participation is really important and it's really tricky. And it's one area where I think commissions will want to be really clear up front about their expectations so that they aren't disappointed later when utilities file their plans. So do you want the utility to engage stakeholders at the beginning in deciding what assumptions to use or what scenarios to analyze? Or do you just want them involved after the utilities filed a complete plan? And after the plan is filed, will you require intervention? And maybe follow a formal contested case process? Or do you want to take a more informal approach to soliciting stakeholder comments? And the last one I'll suggest here is that the commission might want to clarify when it issues an order starting this process, how it will evaluate the prudence of future distribution system investments made by the utility. Maybe, for example, you want to establish a rebuttable presumption that an investment is prudent if it's included in an approved IDP. Maybe you'll want to require the utility to file a notification and an explanation if it plans to make a big investment that isn't included in an approved IDP. So it's that sort of thing. Next slide, please. Another thing you might want to do at the outset in your order that starts the planning process might be to address the relationship of distribution planning to other ongoing or upcoming commission proceedings. And I've listed some of them here, and I think Kurt's alluded to these, as did one of the questions after Kurt's presentation. But there are some hopefully obvious connections between a distribution planning process, as Kurt described it, and grid modernization initiatives. Kurt suggested that grid mod might follow or come out of an IDP. But the reality is that some states have begun grid modernization before they've even considered integrated distribution planning. So the point here is just that the commission might want to think about synergies and how to coordinate such proceedings. The same is true for interconnection standards and procedures. You saw that on Kurt's IDP process map. Resource planning and transmission planning processes. Maybe you want to coordinate those through ensuring that each type of planning process is using a common set of assumptions. Or maybe the data from one planning process, you want to make sure it's fed into another process. Your commission might be thinking about changes to the electric utility business model or alternative rate making options. Which kind of gets at the reference Kurt made to pricing as a possible solution to meeting distribution needs. And your state might even be thinking about the creation of a distribution system operator. So those are some possible synergies with other proceedings that you might want to think about at the time that you're issuing the order that starts this planning process. Next slide. So once the commission issues its order, the utilities will get down to the business of planning, and that will probably resemble the steps that Kurt outlined earlier. So I'm not going to take any time repeating those here. I will just note that they are detailed in the MADRI guide to distribution planning. Next slide, please. Eventually, the utility or utilities are going to file a draft or a proposed plan with the commission, and then interveners or stakeholders will have some opportunity to review and comment on the plan. At least I hope they will. That might be formal, it might be informal, but hopefully they'll have a chance to weigh in. And the commission itself will be reviewing the draft plan as well as stakeholder or intervener comments, and then making a determination about whether that plan is consistent with the order and any statutory requirements, and whether that plan is acceptable to the commission or requires improvement. Next slide. If the commission finds that the draft plan is not acceptable, they will typically offer guidance or direction to the utility on how to cure any defects or deficiencies. And then that might restart the planning and filing process. But eventually the utility will file a revised plan or a final plan. Next slide, please. And hopefully the initial plan or the revised plan will be acceptable to the commission. The process usually ends with the commission issuing an order that either acknowledges the plan as satisfying minimum requirements, or perhaps even more pointedly approving the plan. And after that order is issued, the utility will go about its business. It'll implement its action plan, and it will seek cost recovery at an appropriate time through whatever your normal cost recovery processes are, typically a rate case. Next slide. So the MADRI guide is not yet final. It's getting very close. I think I have sign off from 3 of the 7 jurisdictions that have a member on the steering committee. But the current draft document is available on the website if you're chomping at the bit to look at it. The link is noted here. The final document will be posted on the same web page when it's ready, which is hopefully in the next month. And I'd be happy to share with people a notification when that document is finalized and posted. But before I conclude, I want to repeat one more time that I've walked you through an indicative or generic process. Every state's unique. This process could be tailored to your needs. And pretty obviously, I bet, nothing about it is rocket science. Next slide. My contact information's here. I know you're all eager to hear from Minnesota, and I don't want to take too much from their time, but I would be happy to field a few questions if there are any. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John, for your very thoughtful presentation and walking us through all of that. I don't see any questions that have come in, but I will give folks another chance. Please raise your hand virtually, and I can call on you, or feel free to type in a question if you have one, as we're getting ready for our Minnesota commissioners, commissioner and commissioner staff to be able to talk. We did get one question that just came in from Amy Rittenhouse in Michigan. If distribution investments are escalating, what are the drivers? Delayed investments, gold plating, increased storm damage, or other ideas? John, do you have any reflections you want to offer on that?
Sure. I do think it's a combination of factors. And certainly a big part of it would fall under that broad category that we might call grid modernization. There's certainly a lot of money going into replacing some aging assets that have served us very well for decades. There's probably new categories of expenses related to some grid hardening or resilience activities to cybersecurity and things like that. But I think in general, the costs are going up for a combination of all these reasons. It just might be that for any one investment, there's one of those factors that is the main reason why an investment had to be made.
Sure, that makes good sense. Thank you so much, John. Okay, for time, we will turn to our friends at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. We have both Commissioner Vice Chair Dan Lipschultz on the line and Senior Staff Director Tricia DeBleeker. So Commissioner and Tricia, you're both unmuted from my line, and I have your slides up.
Thank you, Danielle. This is Dan Lipschultz. I'll get it started, and I'm going to take us through some of the slides, and then Tricia will pick up where I leave off. But Tricia, obviously you and I have discussed this. Feel free to chime in with any additional context or specifics that I missed that you think really need to be stated. Looking at the first slide, the next slide over, I don't think yeah, there we go. When we talk about how it started, if you look at these 4 bullet points, I think they really speak to the procedural framework for our integrated distribution system planning process. And these are 4 important points. I'll go through each one of them briefly. First of all, our IDP process is a commission-led investigation, and what we mean by that is that we don't have any specific statutory directive or even any specific statutory authority for distribution planning or a distribution planning process. We chose to do this under our more general authority over our rate-regulated utilities distribution systems. Secondly, we went about this as essentially what we call a case-by-case or generic docket approach instead of a rulemaking. So what we did is we opened up individual investigative dockets for each of the 4 rate-regulated utilities. 3 of them are investor-owned. 1 of them is a cooperative utility that elected to be rate-regulated by the Commission. Lord knows why, but they did. 3, we then finally established distribution planning filing requirements by order rather than, again, by rule, culminating in initial plans that have been filed in 2018 and 2019 this year. And just to unpack each one a little bit for context, the reason obviously we had to go about this as a commission-led investigation is we didn't have a specific directive to do it, but for reasons I'll discuss in a minute, we came to the conclusion that it needed to be done, and I don't think it takes too much to figure out why. Why we chose not to use a rulemaking and go the individual case docket route was, I think, more than anything to allow flexibility and adaptability. We didn't want to be tied to a rule that, first of all, would take a long time to develop. We wanted to move faster. And I think, as most folks here know, most rulemaking processes are highly involved and detailed and take a lot of time. And if you want to change the initial set of rules you put in place, it's going to take some time. And you can often freeze in some specific approaches that need to be adapted in real time faster than a rulemaking would otherwise allow. So we thought the individual case basis and establishing these requirements by order provided the flexibility and adaptability we'd need to tackle this pretty new area in a changing and pretty dynamic industry. But before we even got to the point of a commission-led investigation and finally issuing an order establishing these IDP processes for the 4 regulated utilities, really what gave rise to this was a commission investigation before this, dating back to 2015, where we opened up an investigation to explore grid modernization. And we ended up in 2016 issuing a report, a grid modernization report, and one of the major conclusions from that report was you really can't talk about and start pursuing the modernization of the distribution grid without linking it to a planning process. And I think the reasons for that are obvious. You're talking about massive investments and changes in a distribution system, and you need to integrate those consideration of those massive investments into a planning process that looks at whether they're cost effective, what alternatives you have, whether you should even engage in some of those or not, and over what time frame. So, and it gets back to, I think, the point Kurt made. Grid modernization is inextricably linked with planning. The two go together. And I think that became clear in our grid modernization investigation, and that's what led to this commission-led investigation to initiate and eventually establish an integrated distribution planning process. If you go to the next slide, after we concluded as a result of that grid modernization docket that we needed to start down the road of establishing an integrated distribution planning process, we started with workshops, and we've had a tradition, and it's worked really well in Minnesota, of broad stakeholder involvement that often but not always starts with workshops. And in this case, we thought it was important to get a broad swath of stakeholders in the room with utilities and staff and regulators to start talking about what a distribution planning process would mean, what it would involve, and first and foremost, find out what utilities we're currently doing. I don't know if it was John or Kurt, maybe both of you made the point, and it was an important point. It's not as if utilities have just suddenly started doing distribution planning in Minnesota or anywhere else. They've been doing it for a long time. The real key, and I think, John, you made this point, was transparency into what they're doing, and I would add to that regulatory and stakeholder participation in that planning process. Utilities have their own biases. They can miss things. When you bring other stakeholders and regulators into the mix with the utilities in a public, transparent planning process, we've been doing this in IRP for a long time, and now at the distribution level, you can get better results, and we're hoping that that's what we'll end up getting. But when we went through this workshop process, just some specific things we learned about utilities, and then some things I think utilities learned from us before we even started down the more formal route of establishing an IDP process. And one was, we learned just how siloed utilities are, and Kurt, I think, touched on this. You had different parts of the utility really not knowing what the others were doing. And that was really important for us to learn, not that we didn't suspect it already, but it really became clear. And one of the things the utilities learned from us was, first of all, just how serious we were about going down this path. And as a result, they were able to start gearing up for what eventually became this IDP process that they're now implementing. They started to sort of break down those silos internally. And they started looking more closely at their distribution investments in conjunction with some of the grid modernization ideas that came up in the grid modernization docket. Utilities had the ramp time then to start ramping up their distribution engineering staff to be in a better position to deal with a public, transparent distribution planning process. And so all of that stuff that emerged from the workshop process really teed things up well to move forward from that. And if you go to the next slide, we followed up the workshops with a questionnaire, and that questionnaire then gave rise to a notice and comment process. What are utilities currently doing in their distribution plan? What do they assume in their current plan? And what are ways that utilities and other stakeholders might have in mind to improve or augment utility planning processes? And so out of the workshop with this questionnaire, which was a lot more detailed than you see here, we teed up a lot of questions for all parties, including the utilities, but other stakeholders, to address in a pretty extensive comment process. So we then took a lot of written comments from the parties, stakeholders, and utilities, and from that we were able to eventually put together the distribution planning process we have in place today. If you go ahead to the next slide, we established some pretty clear goals, I think, certainly for us, but also for the utility and for stakeholders. A foundational understanding of the utility's long-term distribution plans, context for individual utility investment requests, a proactive consideration of potential futures and non-traditional methods of planning, system reliability, efficient uses of resources, maximized customer benefits, and of course public policy goals, which include things I think we're all familiar with, obviously affordable rates, reliable service, but also decarbonization, which is a major policy goal here in Minnesota as well as a number of other states. And so if you go to the next slide, I'm going through this pretty quickly. Tricia's going to take you through the process in more detail as she unpacks each component part of it, and then I might chime in with a few more comments. But if you look here, eventually out of the workshop process, the known as comment process, we ended up, our staff developed straw proposals on what a distribution planning process would look like, what the elements of it should be, what we'd want utilities to file with us. And the commission reviewed the staff proposals and took comment from stakeholders and utilities on those staff straw proposals. We made adjustments The commission did based on the input we got, based on further discussions with our staff, and ultimately we issued a commission decision that, if you look at the next slide, in a broad sense, established what you see here. We're requiring utilities to file baseline data. We're requiring them to provide hosting capacity and interconnection information, DER forecasting, long-term system modernization and infrastructure plans that the utility has, if they have any, and most of them do, as well as a non-wires alternative analysis. I will turn it over to Tricia now, and she will take you through each of those, starting with baseline data, and unpack it all a little bit for you. And then I might come in with some final thoughts on what we've gotten so far and where we think we're going. Tricia?
Great, thanks everybody. This is Tricia Blaker, and I'm going to go through what Commissioner Lipschultz just explained, which was the baseline data requirements. Two things I do want to note before we get into the requirements are we had to make kind of two concessions to some degree to get the planning requirements in place and to really make our utilities comfortable with the long list of filing requirements that we asked for. The first was that we essentially, in conversations with them, found that they were very concerned that we were going to impede in their day-to-day distribution system planning, and that's kind of the cycle that Kurt showed before was the historic planning process and how they do it internally to, you know, get load to or get electricity to a new hospital, to move a line because of a highway. And we really had to get on the same page with our utilities to make them understand that that is not what we were going to be messing with or not going to be asking about or not getting in the way of. And second, there was another filing there. The filing requirements we required were pretty onerous in some areas, and there was a lot of concern that they didn't have the tools or the methods needed to fulfill those requirements. So we added a provision that indicated that if any of the filing requirements could not be met, we weren't going to waive them, which they were asking us to do. We were asking them to then give us any information they could in lieu of the filing requirement. And second, explain to us when and how long it would take to be able to fulfill that filing requirement. So we didn't essentially let them get off the hook for anything with a waiver or any sort of variant. So first, the baseline data requirements. We had three different buckets. It was system, financial, and DER. And so the first one, the system, while the questionnaire gave us a really good foundation of what our utility systems look like today, we wanted to make sure we were doing that check-in with each filing cycle on what changes essentially occurred in their last year or 2 years since they had filed their last IDP. And so that system information will get us some of that information that even Kurt was referring to on essentially feeder loading or substation loading to see how efficiently they're using their system and how that efficiency is tracked or changes over time. In addition to how their visibility on their system is changing, what kind of software they had, what have they implemented since the last time we had checked in with them on their IDP. And so there's a whole long list that we have, and I can provide these to anyone that would like them afterward, but I'm going to get to the high level now. So the second one is the financial data. For all of our utilities, we asked for a 5-year historic look and then a 5-year future outlook of what they're spending on, what they're essentially taking that line item in their rate case that has always said distribution system costs X and breaking it apart so we can understand through their essentially capacity expansion, so what kind of IT investments they're making, and how those are changing over the past 5 years. And then we're getting a every year to 2 year update on these plans. Then the third is pretty self-explanatory, the distributed energy resources status check. So how many DERs do you have in your system and how has that changed? The commission did expand their definition of DER to include energy efficiency and demand response. And so I know some of our utilities are struggling with how exactly to report that in our data through looking at it through a distribution system lens versus a wholesale capacity kind of carve off the top. So for the next slide, if we could go to hosting capacity and interconnection. And so these filing requirements were really the where our utilities diverged the most between the four that Commissioner Lipschultz mentioned, and specifically hosting capacity. Our largest utility, Excel, has a requirement by statute to complete a hosting capacity report on their distribution system. Our other three utilities do not. So they are much smaller, they have much lesser levels of DER penetration and much fewer annual interconnection requirement or requests. So looking at what we want from our utilities, while we were being asked to look at hosting capacity for all our utilities, it was really a question of how much value we're going to get out of the information for the cost it would take for our utilities to implement that software modeling and engineering time. So we didn't necessarily find it was needed, hosting capacity studies were needed for all our utilities, but we did request in lieu of that, daytime minimum load levels on each feeder for some of our smaller utilities. We haven't received that data yet. It should be coming this fall. And so we will further that discussion with those utilities. Next slide. All right, so then the DER scenario analysis. We asked our utilities, all of them, to file DER adoption scenarios. And so really we were looking at a very high level, show us what you believe your baseline DER forecast to be, your medium level or your high level. And we didn't define what medium or high penetration scenarios were. We asked them to go work that out with stakeholders and come back to us. And so Excel was the first one to file their first plan last year. They did a pretty good job with that analysis. They said they'd do work on it in the future, but we really struggled with this one with our utilities who would bring their distribution engineering folks in, whose heads would literally explode when they thought about doing this work, because they have very limited, still to this day, have limited distribution engineering staff, and their view of this is to do feeder by feeder forecasts. And we just had to explain and work through it and work through the language of our filing requirements to explain that's not what we're looking for yet. We needed just more of the broad trends of DER on the system, and when you were looking at those DER forecasts, what it would take for their systems to accommodate that level of penetration. And so would they need new systems, new visibility, or what would it do? That then feeds back into our grid modernization investment information, which I'll get to in a second, to determine how fast or to what levels they would need to essentially modernize parts of their system that aren't yet modernized. So you can go to the next slide. This gets to the long-term distribution system infrastructure plan. And this has increasingly become a very important part of our IDP process. And so when you think of distribution system planning, you know, most engineers go to that feeder by feeder look and forecasting. However, the more we get into this, the more we realize, and I'm sure you've heard the conversations going around this industry about the grid architecture and what parts of your system do you modernize, in what order, and at what cost. And so a large part of this, our IDP, is a 5-year and a 10-year outlook on what they're investing in what order, and why. And so this gets to the DOE's work on grid architecture and different alternatives analysis. And when you say alternatives analysis, even the options they're choosing within their investment plans. So why did you explore volt bar optimization before you went to Flizzr, or the inverse? And so those questions they have costs associated with them, and they really matter to the value that you bring back to your ratepayer. So this part of the report, which is again, you know, a page of filing requirements, really gets to tell us the story of how and why you're modernizing your grid and what you're spending on it and for what value. And that includes a very cursory cost-benefit analysis that, again, we don't essentially hold them to. They'll be required to file a concrete cost-benefit analysis at the point of cost recovery. But at this early stage, we wanted to make sure we understand what the value proposition is. And the next slide is the non-wires alternative analysis. And so we asked our utilities to take any distribution system projects that were greater than $2 million in cost and evaluate those for the scope of alternatives that could be used in lieu of the traditional build out of capacity. And so our utility in the first round, they really only had a few months to put the report together, was able to come up with a few options that they compared, 2 options actually. And it wasn't necessarily as in-depth as other states have done or have gotten in their reports and their different analysis that they've done, the ones Kurt and both John spoke about. However, what it did was it showed transparency. And it really allowed us to see, and the stakeholders to see, what assumptions our utilities were putting into their planning process for looking at alternative options to the traditional options always put before them. And so in addition to requiring them to do an analysis on at least a handful of projects to tell us what that cost benefit kind of tipping point would be, the other piece within that I thought was even more important was we asked them to explain how they were changing their internal process for distribution system planning so that they would be able to incorporate non-wires alternative analysis within their utility systems. And so this wasn't essentially a special projects division that would do this work. It would be an internal process within all of their distribution system planners' desks that would show them they have to go through these hurdles before they pick the traditional solution. And that is the last one that I have. So Commissioner Lipschultz, do you want to touch on the last slide?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Tricia. So looking ahead, I think we're learning as we go, and because we've chosen to take the order rather than the rulemaking path, we're going to be able to adjust the requirements as we go. I think right now we're requiring Excel to file every year and the other utilities to file every other year. We might change Excel to a biennial reporting or filing requirement. We're not there yet. But in any case, we learn as we go, and we need to get a good sense of what's reasonable and possible to require from utilities. There might be a lot of things we want, or especially that some stakeholders will want, that might not be cost effective to provide, but utilities, I think, are going to be loath to provide everything that we really do need to fully evaluate their plans going forward. And then we're going to have to use this planning process, and this is the key really, to assess the value of various investment alternatives. That's really the key to all this. What value are we getting? How quickly do we need to move? Those are the questions ultimately we're going to have to answer, and that's why we're going to need the information that allows us to really assess the value we're getting as the public's getting and the ratepayers are getting from different investments that the utility can make. There are all sorts of options, and there are non-traditional options on the table now, we hope, as part of this process that would, we think, perhaps lead to better value, getting more out of the system for less. And then we're going to continue to learn about the information we need to substantiate or support the investments or the investment proposals that a utility is contemplating as part of this planning process. And then we're going to incorporate policy preferences into the mix that we have as a commission, that stakeholders bring to us, so we know where we want to push and what direction we want utilities to go, where we want them to focus their investments, and where we want them to not be as focused. And ultimately, to what extent are we trying to transform the distribution system into something different from what it is today? And what's the value proposition of the changes that we might be thinking about to that system? Right, and I think part of that may be my final point. We have 4 utilities, and they're all very different. Just taking the 3 investor-owned utilities, we have XL, which is by far the largest. It serves about 60% of the load in the state, and we have 45 distribution cooperative utilities. So that just gives you a measure of how big a chunk of the load XL serves, and they're primarily urban, although not entirely. Then we have Otter Tail Power up in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. It's very, very rural. It's actually the smallest investor-owned utility in the country, with very, very spread out ratepayer base. We have Minnesota Power up in the Northeast, which is also very small, although not as small as Otter Tail. 70 to 75% of their load is industrial. They serve about 75% of their load comes from about 9 to 10 customers, large industrial customers. So they're very different, and they present a very different picture. And then Dakota Electric is a sort of suburban, rural cooperative utility that is chosen to be rate regulated by the commission. So I think as this evolves, I think we've already settled on some differences among those 4 utilities, although not so much yet. I think we're going to see more differences develop in the way we handle and treat them in this distribution planning process, although maybe down the road, at the end of the day, they might converge. And I know Tricia has some thoughts on that, but those are my final thoughts on where we're at, where we're going. I don't know if we touched on this finally, but we don't approve these plans, we accept them. We can accept or reject. And that was a conscious decision because we don't have specific statutory direction to do this, so that we would have buy-in from everyone, especially the utilities. We took the position that we would use the power to convene and the transparency as the primary benefit from this planning process. We'll accept the plans if we think they're complete and sufficient. We can reject them if we think they're lacking in analysis or don't have all the information we want, but we don't actually then approve the merits of the plan. And that has, I think, given utilities comfort to be quite compliant, I think, in moving ahead with the process that we've established. And we don't tie our hands in future rate cases. We're not really, at least so far, providing any approval in advance of the investments that are contemplated in these plans. That comes, as Tricia said, at a later date when we require utilities to file the proposed investments for consideration. And I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much from Minnesota and sharing your direct experience. I know that these are the kind of details that folks have really been clamoring for and wanting to understand how tactically and operationally you've gone through these processes. So that was really valuable. I will remind folks we have about 5 minutes for questions. You're welcome to use the virtual raise your hand feature or type in any questions to the chat box. We did have one come through from Michigan for Tricia and Commissioner Lipschultz. Specifically, are the DER forecasts based on utility-owned DER, customer or third-party owned DER, or both? Do you know offhand?
Both?
Yeah. Correct. Yep. Both.
Great. For the more complete view. That is the only question that we had that came through, although I will ask you all one of the questions we received earlier about whether, where did it go? Oh, the question about concerns about cyber and physical security related to revealing details about the distribution grid. Is that something that you all addressed, and how did you come to agreement?
Well, that concern was raised by utilities, and so far, I mean, we haven't specifically required anything that utilities have refused to provide based on cybersecurity or security grounds. But Tricia, I know we've dealt with this, and you've dealt with this. Anything to add to that?
So we, as a first kind of blush stab at this, we asked our utilities to provide certain data and then if they believe there were cybersecurity issues, to carve out the data or the data on certain feeders that they believed were a cybersecurity risk for potentially what reason, if they can disclose it in public, and then explain just the reason for it, and then we would look at those individually. I think we have reached this point with our utilities where they are using that concern as a reason to not file a lot of information, all of the information, when really maybe only 70 or 25% at most of the information should be redacted. And so it's an issue we're dealing with currently.
I think that's right. You know, we so far you know, this could create some real problems down the road, depending on what we ultimately tell utilities we have to have. And so far, we handle it the way we handle confidential or trade secret information. We require the utilities to make the case for not disclosing it or for redacting it, and then we just make a judgment call in each instance. And you know, we can certainly require them to file it with us and provide limited access to us and perhaps the Attorney General and the Department of Commerce. There might be a way to make it more widely available under non-disclosure agreements, but when you're talking about cybersecurity issues, there's a limit to how far you want to go there. So we haven't really hit an impasse yet, but the issue looms.
Wonderful. Thank you for so thoughtfully responding to that question. Okay, it is 4:29, 4:30 momentarily. I'm going to thank all of our panelists once again, Kurt Volkman, John Cheneau, Tricia Bleeker, and Commissioner Lipschultz. That was a fantastically informative webinar on behalf of the task force, and I'm sure that the many dozens of people who joined us thought so as well. This has been recorded. It will be posted on the task force website, and we thank you all so much for your participation. We will be reconvening next month on planning criteria, and you'll see emails about that. So the webinar has now ended. Thank you.